The decision to exile Earth was made. Then humanity made its rules clear. The vote was already at 180 to 2 when I stopped counting. I sat in the human delegation box on the third tier of the conclave chamber and watched 214 species decide the future of 8 billion people in the span of a single procedural session. The hall smelled of copper and warm metal the way it always did when the translator fog ran at full capacity. My pen sat untouched on my notepad. I had nothing left to write. Director Grant had sent me a message 3 hours before the session, 2 sentences. They have the numbers, do not react. I had not responded. The conclave chamber was designed to make every delegate feel small. It worked. The ceiling stretched 40 m. Overhead, lined with bioluminescent panels that shifted color depending on the current voting phase. Right now they glowed a pale, clinical yellow. Affirmative, the color of things being decided without your input. I'd been coming to this chamber for 9 years. I had signed 3 major trade agreements in it. I had negotiated the Kepler Accords in the back corridors of it in a room that smelled of recycled air and compromise. I knew every tier, every delegate box, every procedural tool that could slow or accelerate a vote. None of those tools were available to me. Today, I had used my formal objection 2 days earlier. It was noted, filed. The conclave moved on. The Veth delegate sat 4 tiers below me and to my left. His name, properly translated, took about 40 seconds to say out loud, so everyone in the diplomatic corps simply called him Delegate Veth, which he tolerated without comment. He had secondary mandibles along his jaw. That clicked when he was pleased with himself. They had been clicking since the session opened. The vote counter on the main display updated again. 193 to 2. The resolution on the floor was 46 lines of formal galactic language. I had read it 11 times. The core of it, stripped of all ceremony and procedure, was simple. Humanity was being removed from the conclave, not suspended, not sanctioned. Removed, the word they used was exile, and they had chosen it carefully because it had no ambiguity. Exile meant outside. Exile meant the door closed behind you and there was no handle on your side. They had been building toward this for 3 years. The official reasoning was stability. Humanity, the resolution argued, was a destabilizing presence in galactic governance. We were too unpredictable, too aggressive in negotiations, too willing to act without waiting for consensus in situations that the conclave felt required it. They cited 7 specific incidents. 4 of them were things I had personally done. I was not proud of all of them. I was not ashamed of any of them either. 211 to 2. 2 more species to vote. The Drev, who I already knew were no, and the Murath. The Murath had opposed humanity since first contact 40 years ago. It was one of those diplomatic relationships that started badly and then, through persistent effort on both sides, managed to grow worse every decade. They had filed 17 formal complaints against human conclave members in the past 6 years alone. I had been named in 4 of them. The Murath delegate rose. The chamber went quiet. She cast her vote. No. I wrote that down carefully in small letters on the corner of my notepad, where I had written nothing else all session. The Drev voted no as well. Final tally, 211 to 3. The certification light above the main display turned green. The conclave president, a relath with a voice like gravel rolling down a metal pipe, read the result into the formal record. Resolution 77, accord regarding the status of species designation H7, Terran. Human, pass with full procedural compliance. The transition period would be 90 cycles. Humanity retained the right to submit a formal response within 30 cycles. He used the word humanity 4 times in 2 sentences. He said it the way you say the name of something you have already packed into a box. I requested the floor for the following morning. The session coordinator assigned me 8:00 in the morning, the first slot of the day, the one they give you when they expect you to be brief. I packed my notepad into my bag, stood, adjusted my jacket. The human delegation staff around me were very quiet. My assistant Nora was staring at her hands. Felix, our senior legal officer, was already typing, his eyes moving fast over whatever document was open on his screen. Felix, I said. He looked up. Tonight, I said, everything we have. Every treaty reference, every infrastructure dependency, every licensing agreement and joint operation contract. I want the full picture by midnight. He nodded and went back to typing faster. I walked out of the chamber without looking at the vote display again. I already knew the number, 211. 211 species that had just made a very large decision without fully understanding what they had decided. I called Director Grant from the corridor outside, standing near a window that looked out over the conclave plaza. The plaza was filled with delegates and staff moving in the slow, purposeful way of people who believe the important things have already been handled. Grant answered on the first ring. How bad, he said. Depends on which side you are asking. For I said. A pause. Mara, he said. I requested the floor for tomorrow morning. I said 8:00. What are you going to say? I watched a group of Veth staffers cross the plaza below. Their mandibles were clicking. Something helpful, I said. I ended the call. Nora appeared at my elbow with a coffee. Real coffee from the human commissary. 2 floors down, it was thin and slightly burned, but it was ours, and she knew I would want it. I took it. 8:00 in the morning is very early, she said. Yes, I said. Do you have a plan? I looked out at the plaza, at 211 species going about their evening, comfortable in the certainty of what they had just done. I want to be very clear, I said, mostly to myself. Nora waited. That is the plan, I said. She looked uncertain. Good, that was the appropriate response. I went back to my office and worked until 4:00 in the morning. Felix and his team worked beside me throughout. By the time I finally leaned back in my chair and looked at the full picture spread across 4 screens, I had stopped feeling the particular cold weight that had been sitting in my chest since the vote. What replaced it was something much more useful. 211 species had voted to exile humanity. Not one of them had stopped to ask what that would actually cost them. The chamber was full at 8:00 in the morning. That was unusual. Normally the morning session drew a fraction of the full assembly. Today every tier had Delegates in their seats, the gallery. Rows technically reserved for observers. And press were packed to the back wall. I counted 3 species I had never seen. Attend a morning session in 9 years. Word traveled fast in a building full of professional communicators. I walked to the podium at exactly 8:00. I set my notes in front of me, 1 sheet both sides formatted in the small clean print that Felix had produced at 5:00 in the morning after I had told him twice the text needed to be smaller. I looked up. Delegate Veth's mandibles were still. That was new. I want to be very clear, I said, about what exile means. The chamber's ambient noise, the low background hum of translator fog and ventilation, and the small sounds of 400 bodies in the same room softened, not silence close to it. This resolution was framed as a question about humanity's fitness for conclave membership. I said, I understand that framing. I even understand why some of you believe it. We are not easy partners. We have never been easy partners. We move when consensus says hold. We snorts push where the conclave prefers to wait. I have personally been the source of no fewer than 4 formal diplomatic complaints in the past 6 years, and I want to assure this chamber that I consider that number to be low. A small sound moved through the gallery. Not laughter exactly, something closer to recognition. But this resolution was not truly a question about humanity's behavior. I said it was a question about what the conclave can afford. And GT snorts. And GT, and that I am happy to address. I looked at my notes. Then I set them aside. Felix in the delegation box went completely still. I had told him the notes were backup. He had believed me until this moment. The Kepler Trade Accords, I said, require a human signatory, not as a formality, as a structural legal requirement written into the accord at the request of both the Veth hegemony and the Oran collective, because we are the only species in the conclave that both parties will accept as a neutral intermediary. Those 2 parties are currently in 9 active trade disputes. When I'm no longer conclave member, there is no intermediary. The disputes go to open arbitration under conclave law. Arbitration takes between 4 and 9 years. I checked this morning. There are 11 billion in pending transaction value sitting in those disputes. No clicking from any of the Veth mandibles in the room. The Sheth Passage quarantine corridors, I said, maintained by human staff, 44 personnel at 6 stations, rotating on 18-month cycles because the biological risk profile is, and I'm quoting the conclave's own medical assessment here, beyond the tolerance threshold of all currently registered member species. We volunteer for it. We have been volunteering for 11 years. The corridors have held. In that time, there have been 0 cross-species transmission events in the Sheth Passage. I let that sit for a moment. 0, I said again pleasantly. Post-exile, those stations have no staff. The conclave is welcome to recruit. The position listings are already drafted. I would note that the application requirements include biological certifications, that approximately 3 currently registered species can physically meet. Of those 3, 2 are already at maximum deployment capacity. I am happy to provide references for the 3rd. The Economic Board Chair, a heavyset Relay, seated in the observer section, had stopped writing on whatever he had been writing on. He was watching me the way people watch, something moving faster than they expected. The Babel Archive, I said. 41 years of xenolinguistic research, every major language, dialect, and communication system cataloged by human researchers and compiled into the single most comprehensive translation resource in known space, currently licensed to the Conclave Diplomatic Corps, currently licensed at no cost. A pause. Exile reclassifies us as unaffiliated. Unaffiliated parties negotiate under commercial frameworks. I have the commercial framework rates. I did not read them. I watched 3 delegates reach for their personal screens. Use your economists, I said. It will be faster. The chamber had a quality of silence now that I had never heard in 9 years of conclave sessions. It was the silence of math being done by people who did not like the numbers they were finding. I thought about the Kepler Accords, about the room where I signed them, the recycled air and the long table, and Director Grant's predecessor, a man named Cole, who had retired 2 years later and never discussed that day with anyone. Cole had told me that sometimes you had to give something to get something. That was diplomacy. That was the long game. I had believed him. I picked up my notes. You voted to exile us because we are dangerous, I said. I understand that. We know we are. We have known that longer than you have known we exist. That is not a boast. It is simply true. We grew up on a planet that spent 4 billion years trying to end us, and the ones who survived were the ones who refused to sit still. That tendency did not disappear when we found the stars. It will not disappear now. Delegate Veth had not moved in 7 minutes. But I want to be very clear, I said. I looked directly at him. There is a significant difference between a dangerous partner and a dangerous party with nothing left to lose. You have just voted for the second configuration. I want to make sure that was intentional. I stepped back from the podium. I did not wait for the gavel. I walked back to the delegation box and sat down and picked up my coffee, which Nora had kept warm, and drank it while the chamber tried to remember how to produce sound. Felix leaned toward me. You went off the notes, he said. Yes, I said. From the 3rd sentence. Yes. The entire speech was off the notes. The notes were back up. He sat back. The conclave president called a recess. They never called recesses after formal response statements. It was not in the procedural handbook. He called one anyway, 15 minutes, and the chamber erupted into the kind of floor movement that meant a great many people were very urgently consulting with a great many other people. Nora put a second coffee in my hand. That was not what they expected, she said. No, I said. Is it going to work? I watched Delegate Veth leave the chamber floor with 4 of his staff moving tightly around him. Something is going to happen, I said. Whether it is what I want is a separate question. What do you want? She said. I thought about it the way you can only think honestly when you have been awake for 27 hours, and the effort of pretending to be composed is more than you can afford. I want what we gave up in the Kepler Accords back, I said, all of it. Nora was quiet for a moment. That is a lot, she said. Yes, I said. Director Grant's message arrived on my Screen 30 seconds later, 3 words. That was enough. I put my screen away. It was not enough yet, but it was a start, and I had 89 cycles left to turn. A start into everything. The transition period began the way most consequential things begin, with paperwork. The conclave issued a formal transition schedule. Committees were formed. Subcommittees were formed to support the committees. A working group was established specifically to manage the transfer of human diplomatic responsibilities to other conclave members, and within 4 days it had its first emergency meeting because no other conclave member would accept 3 of the core responsibilities. I attended that meeting. I sat at the back and said nothing. The working group spent 2 hours discovering problems I had already documented and forwarded to them the previous week. At the end of the meeting, the chair, thorough and somewhat tense, Drev named Advisor Tal, approached me in the corridor. Ambassador Reyes, he said, the quarantine station staffing gap. I know, I said. The biological clearance requirements alone. I know, I said. Is there any possibility that? File a formal request, I said. We will review it under current commercial frameworks. He stared at me. I smiled and walked away. Felix caught up with me at the elevator. He had the look of a man who had been moving fast all morning and had considerably more moving ahead of him. The Reth Pharmaceutical Consortium sent a representative. He said they want to renegotiate the compound licensing before the Exile formally takes effect. How early did they arrive? They were in the lobby when the building opened. I thought about the 47 medical compounds currently licensed to conclave member species at cost, developed in human research facilities over 30 years by people who believed that access to medicine was not something you priced against the ability to pay. We had given those compounds to the conclave at cost because it was the right thing to do and because we were trying to be good partners. Tell them noon, I said. Should I prepare a position paper? Tell them to bring their own. The noon meeting was short. The Reth representative, a compact and extremely well-dressed individual named Advisor Penn, presented a framework for renegotiated licensing that preserved most of the current cost structure while acknowledging the change in status. It was, in its own way, a reasonable offer, the kind you make when you believe the other party will accept a reasonable offer because they have always accepted reasonable offers before. I set our new rate sheet on the table. Advisor Penn looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. This is, he said carefully, considerably higher. Yes, I said. The current rate has been in place for 30 years. The current rate was set by a conclave member operating under partnership obligations. I said, we are now an unaffiliated entity. The rate reflects that. He made a sound the translator rendered as internal distress. I did not adjust the rate sheet. He asked for 2 weeks to consult with his board. Of course, I said. He left. Felix closed the door. How many of these meetings are on the schedule? I asked. 14 this week, Felix said. 31 next week. Good, I said. The Sheth Passage situation resolved itself in the way problems resolve when you simply wait for reality to confirm what you already know. By the 3rd week of the transition period, 4 species had submitted Emergency petitions to the conclave, requesting a specific exemption from the exile terms, not a reversal of the exile, just an exemption covering the quarantine corridors, just that one thing. The petitions went to the conclave legal committee. The legal committee determined that exemptions required the consent of the exiled party. The exiled party was us. I had our response prepared before they finished drafting the request. Yes, we would consent to the exemption under the condition that the 44 human personnel currently stationed at the quarantine posts were reclassified under new employment terms, hazard reclassification, retroactive to their hire date. The number was significant. The conclave approved it in 6 days, which by their standards was essentially a sprint. Director Grant called that evening. The quarantine crews are very happy, he said. They were always underpaid, I said. The conclave legal office sent a note. He said they used the word unprecedented twice. That is their concern, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Mara, he said. Something else, I said. The Economic Board sent a preliminary inquiry, not through official channels, through a trade attaché they use when they want to ask something they do not want appearing on the formal record. I already knew what it was going to be. They want to know if we would consider preferred trade status, I said. Before the exile finalizes, lock in favorable terms now so we come out of the transition period in a cooperative posture. Silence. You already knew, he said. I expected it, I said. They are practical people do the math and then they reach out. What do you want to tell them? Nothing yet, I said. Let them think about it for 2 more weeks. That might make them nervous. Yes, I said. I had an unexpected meeting the following morning, a private request, delivered through the Murreth diplomatic office, which was the equivalent of receiving a letter from someone who had, on 2 public occasions, stated that your civilization was a net problem for the galaxy. The myriad ambassador was very old. She moved carefully and smelled of copper, and something that reminded me of old paper left in a drawer for decades. Her name required a breath control I could not physically achieve, so I called her ambassador and she accepted it without comment. We sat in a private meeting room on the 4th floor. Her aide brought real tea properly brewed, which surprised me. You are wondering why I voted no, she said. I assumed I would find out eventually. I said, we have opposed human membership for 40 years, she said. We filed 17 complaints. We requested 3 separate reviews of humanity's provisional status. 4, I said. The 4th was partially sealed. She looked at me. Something in her expression shifted the way things shift when someone realizes they underestimated you before the conversation started. An exiled humanity, she said slowly, is a humanity with no reason to remain polite. I let that sit. For 40 years the conclave has been the structure that kept you inside. Boundaries, she said, rules. Committees, the Kepler Accords. You did things you did not want to do because you wanted to stay in the room. Yes, I said. We did not want you exiled, she said. We wanted you bound. Those are different outcomes. The other 211 species did not understand that distinction. I was not able to convince them in time. I looked at my tea. You could have spoken against the resolution, I said. I tried, she said. They heard concern. About procedure, not about consequence. They see what they expect to see. She lifted her own cup. What are you going to do? She said. Whatever we have to, I said. She nodded slowly. I know, she said, that is what concerns me, and also strangely why I think it will be all right. We finished the tea. I walked back to the delegation offices, through the long corridor that ran along the outside of the conclave building, with its windows looking out over the transit hub and the 6 landing pads and the constant movement of ships arriving from every part of the galaxy. I had walked this corridor 100 times. I had always walked it as a member, as someone with a seat in the room and a right to the view. I walked it now as something else, something without a label yet. The Economic Board's preliminary inquiry was still sitting unanswered on my secure channel. I left it there. 2 weeks, I had told Grant, let them think. Exile, I was learning, had a very interesting effect on the people doing the exiling. They had expected us to knock on the door and ask to come back in. We had not knocked on anything. We had opened our own offices, reviewed our own contracts, and started charging for things we had been providing at no cost for 30 years, and the galaxy was discovering, one negotiation at a time, that the price of human generosity was not zero. It had never been zero. We had simply chosen for a long time not to present the bill. That choice was over. The bill was on the table. We had 62 cycles remaining before the Exile became final. The formal list session was scheduled for cycle 40, the midpoint. Procedurally, it was called a transition status review, which was the conclave's way of asking humanity to confirm what it was pulling out of, what it was holding on to, and what it was offering for negotiated transfer. The answer to all 3 questions was the same list. We had simply organized it differently depending on which column you were reading. Felix had worked on the document for 3 weeks. He had a team of 11, and they had not slept enough, and they had done extraordinary work. When he handed me the final draft at 6:00 in the morning on the day of the session, he looked like a man who had run a very long distance and was not certain he had arrived somewhere good. It is accurate, he said. Good, I said. All of it is accurate, he said. Felix, I said. Yes. Get some sleep after this. He nodded and went to prepare the presentation materials. The session was closed, not a public chamber session, but a formal transition review in conference room 7. Large, well-lit room on the conclave's administrative floor with a long table and no gallery seating, and the kind of functional quiet that meant business. 14 species at the table, the conclave president, the economic board chair, 3 members of the legal committee, Delegate Veth, and me. Nora sat at my left, Felix at my right. 2 more of our legal staff behind us. I opened the document. I will begin with infrastructure, I said. The relay network came first. The FTL relay network in the outer Keth corridor had been built 14 years ago, under a conclave exploration permit, issued specifically to human vessels. The permit was routine. The network that resulted was not, over 14 years through gradual expansion and connection work that the conclave had approved without fully tracking the human-built relay Network had become the primary signal, backbone for 40% of all conclave deep space communication in the outer quadrant, human-owned equipment, human maintenance, contracts, human technical staff at 11 relay stations. Post-exile, I said, all maintenance contracts require renegotiation under commercial frameworks applicable to unaffiliated entities. All technical staff are employed by human-registered companies and will continue their roles. Under new employment terms, signal access for conclave members will be billed at infrastructure access rates. The conclave president looked at the economic board chair. The economic board chair was doing math. The math was not making him comfortable. The rates are attached as Appendix C. I said, they are. I think you will find competitive. I moved to the next item. The Babel Archive, 41 years, 6,200. Individual researchers, the most complete xenolinguistic database ever compiled. It covered every known language family in conclave space with subdialects, communication variations, historical language states, and real-time translation modeling that the conclave diplomatic corps had been using as its foundation layer for 3 decades, free of charge. Post-exile, the archive transitions to subscription access. I said, pricing tiers are attached as Appendix D. The conclave diplomatic corps qualifies for the institutional rate, which is a significant discount from the open market rate. The legal committee member to my right made a sound I did not recognize. I did not ask for a translation. The quarantine corridors were next. The stations, the personnel, the 11 years of biological containment data that was itself a research resource worth considerable value because it documented containment methods no other species had been willing to develop. No other species had been willing to staff the stations long enough to gather the data. The containment methodology library is currently held as restricted internal research. I said, we are open to licensing discussions. The delegate Veth had not moved in 20 minutes. His mandibles were completely still. I thought briefly about the first time I had sat across from a Veth delegate 12 years ago, before I was ambassador, before the Kepler Accords, before any of this, a trade discussion about mineral rights in the Outer Rim. The Veth delegate at that meeting had spoken to me the way you speak to someone you are tolerating, patient, faintly bored, waiting for the room to finish. That meeting had lasted 6 hours. I had left with everything I came for. The Veth delegate had been surprised. He should not have been. I kept reading. The Joint Research Programs, 7 long-term scientific collaborations between human institutions and conclave members covering fields from xenobiology to astrophysics to materials engineering. In every case, the human contribution was significant, and in 4 cases the human team was the lead investigator. Post-exile, the collaborations could continue under core research agreements with unaffiliated party terms, which meant the intellectual property division would need to be renegotiated from the beginning. Every program, every agreement, every contract, item after item after item. The room grew quieter with each one. Then I reached the standing watch program. I had written this section myself 3 weeks ago at 3:00 in the morning when Felix and his team were working on the financial sections, and I was alone with a cold cup of coffee and the part of the document I had been putting off. I read it. The Standing Watch program had begun 9 years ago as a voluntary posting for human military and civil service personnel. The concept was simple. The conclave had border regions that were technically the responsibility of member species, but in practice, no. Member species had the resources, the geographic proximity, or the willingness to maintain a consistent presence at the edge of charted space. These were the far places where mapping was incomplete and contact was unpredictable, and the work was unglamorous and sometimes genuinely difficult. Humans volunteered for it. We always volunteered for it, I snorts. Had never fully understood why, except that I recognized the same tendency in myself. The same thing that made me take the Kepler assignment when no one else wanted it, the same thing that kept me in this building for 9 years after I had every reason to leave. We volunteered because someone had to, and we kept being the ones who said yes. 280 personnel, 11 border watch stations. Some of them had been at their posts for 3 years, some had extended their rotations twice. I read the section heading. Then I read the names. All 280 of 80 of them. I read them steadily in the order they appeared in the document. The table was silent. The economic board chair had put down his pen. The legal committee members had stopped looking at their screens. By the time I reached name 40, Delegate Veth had placed both hands flat on the table. By name 100, the conclave president was looking at the table's surface with an expression I could not precisely read, but which I recognized. I had worn something like it myself in a room with recycled air and a long table 9 years ago. I finished reading at name 280. The room was very quiet. Post-exile, I said, these personnel will be withdrawn during the transition period. They will return to human administered space. The 11 stations will be unstaffed. The conclave is of course welcome to recruit replacements. No one said anything. I closed the document. That concludes the formal transition. Status review, I said. We are available for follow-up questions through the standard channels. I stood. The conclave president looked up. Ambassador Reyes, he said, does humanity have any formal request to enter into the record? I had prepared for this. 1, I said, we request a standard non-harassment agreement covering all personnel during the withdrawal period. 30 cycles, safe passage, no interference, no incidents. He granted it in under 5 seconds. Felix beside me exhaled so quietly I nearly missed it. I gathered my papers. Delegate Veth spoke for the first time since the session began. Ambassador, he said. I looked at him. The names, he said, why read them individually? It was a direct question. It deserved a direct answer. Because they deserve to be said in this room, I said, by someone who knows why they were there. I left. In the corridor outside, Nora fell into step beside me. She said nothing for a long moment. We walked to the elevator. How are you? She said. Tired, I said. The session went well. Yes, I said. She started to say something and then stopped. Going well and being good are different things, I said. Today was necessary. Necessary and good are also different things. She nodded. I had not told anyone about the name. Written at the top of my personal copy of the document, the private draft I had. Written alone at 3:00 in the morning. Above all the formal headers and legal language. A girl I had met once on one of the Kepler colonies the year after the Accords, a daughter with her mother's eyes and a particular stubbornness that only grows in hard places. Her family had been relocated when the colony changed jurisdiction. I had never found out where they went. I had written her name. Cade. Just Cade. No one in conference room 7 had seen it. It was not part of the formal record. It was not a diplomatic argument. It was a reminder. The kind you write so that all the procedure and strategy and careful language does not slowly crowd out the reason you are doing any of it. 49 cycles left. I went back to work. The emergency session request arrived on cycle 71. Not from humanity. That was the detail I needed to remember. It was not us asking to come back. It was them calling us in. The message came through the conclave. President's office marked urgent, requesting a closed negotiating session at the earliest available date. The phrase they used was revised partnership framework. In diplomatic language, that meant they had done the math, done it again to be certain, done it a third time, hoping for a different result, and had arrived at a number they could not ignore. I accepted the session for the following morning. Director Grant called that evening. He had been following the transition reports closely, and he already understood what the session was likely to be. They are going to offer something, he said. Yes, I said. What do you think it will look like? Better than what they gave us 9 years ago, I said. Worse than what we are going to ask for. A pause. Mara, he said, we have a position paper. The legal and strategy teams have been working on it for 6 weeks. There is a range of acceptable outcomes. I have the position paper, I said. I know you have it. I want to know if you're going to use it. I looked at my desk. The position paper sat on the left side. On the right was a single sheet I had written myself 2 days ago in the early morning hours when the building was quiet and I could think without the noise of the process surrounding everything. I am going to use what works, I said. He was quiet long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Do not burn everything down, he said. I will not, I said. I meant it. Burning things down was not the plan. The plan was the opposite of that. The plan was to build something that did not have the same structural problems as the last thing we built. The closed session was held in the conclave's negotiation wing in a room smaller and less formal than the main chamber. 14 species seated at a curved table. The conclave president at the head, the economic board chair 2 seats to his right, Delegate Veth across the table from me with 3 senior diplomatic staff behind him. Notable absence: the Murath. They had sent a written statement of support for the process, but were not participating. I had expected that. The Murath ambassador had told me what she could. The rest was mine to do. The conclave president opened. Ambassador Reyes, he said. Conclave appreciates humanity's cooperation during the transition period. I waited. He was choosing his words with the care of a man crossing ice he was not entirely certain about. It has become apparent, he said, through the transition review process, that the resolution passed 71 cycles ago did not fully account for certain interdependencies. I let that sit on the table. Certain significant interdependencies. He added. Yes, I said. He presented the new framework. It took 20 minutes to outline. It was thorough, well-constructed work. Someone had spent serious time on it and had done so with genuine attention. The new designation was strategic partner, a category that did not previously exist in conclave membership structures. Under this framework, humanity would return to full participation in conclave activities with expanded rights compared to the previous provisional member status, reciprocal defense clauses, and favorable terms on the infrastructure and licensing matters that had been the subject of transition negotiations. It was objectively a good offer. It was substantially better than anything the conclave had offered us in 9 years. It was also exactly what they were willing to give, which was not the same thing as what we were able to get. I let the silence after his presentation run for 30 seconds. 40. I appreciate this framework, I said, and the work that went into it. I want to respond directly because I believe we are close to something real, and I do not want the process to slow down the outcome. I reached into my bag and set a single sheet on the table. Not the position paper. My sheet. Humanity will consider reintegration. I said under the following terms. Delegate Veth, who had arrived at the table with the careful neutral expression of someone who had prepared for multiple scenarios, adjusted slightly in his seat. The 3 human colonies seated under the Kepler Accords, I said, return to human jurisdiction within 40 cycles, full administrative transfer, no phase-in period, no joint management window transfer. The legal committee representative opened his mouth. I understand the Kepler Accords were legally binding at the time, I said. Before he could speak, they were also signed under conditions that this conclave characterized in its own communication to our office in Cycle 30 as a period of inadequate representation of human interests. Those are the conclave's words. I am simply following them to their conclusion. He closed his mouth. The strategic partner designation carries permanent veto rights on any resolution directly affecting human administered systems, I said, not advisory, not consultative, a veto equivalent to the permanent rights currently held by the 5 founding species. The Economic Board chair straightened. That is a significant structural change to the conclave's governance framework. He said. Yes, I said, it is. It is also the correct structural change. The absence of that protection for human systems was the mechanism that made the Kepler Accords possible. We have no interest in leaving that mechanism available again. He looked at the conclave president. I continued. The relay network, the Babel archive, the quarantine corridor infrastructure. I said these transition to jointly held status, human administrative authority, conclave co-funding, operational costs, shared equally, revenue generated from external access shared equally. We are not asking the conclave to give these things to humanity. We are asking the conclave to be honest about the fact that they were built by humanity, maintained by humanity, and function because of humanity, and to structure the ownership accordingly. Delegate Veth spoke. Ambassador, he said, on the relay network, specifically the permit under which it was built was a conclave exploration permit. There a reasonable interpretation under which the infrastructure built under that permit. Appendix 7 of the permit, I said. Subclause 14. Any infrastructure constructed under exploratory permit using exclusively non-conclave materials and non-conclave labor and systems not previously claimed by any conclave member species remains the property of the constructing party, unless transferred by formal agreement. A pause. We used our own materials, I said, our own labor in unclaimed systems for 14 years. He stopped. I have read every permit we ever signed. I said every one. The room was quiet. The standing watch program, I said, 280 people, 11 stations, 11 years. We would like those positions to become the foundation of a new joint border force, fully funded by the conclave, commanded by a human officer, open to volunteers from all member species, rules of engagement written by the current human watch personnel who have the practical knowledge to write them correctly. I paused for a moment. Those rules will be thorough, I said, because those people have been living at the edge of known space for years and they understand exactly what is out there. That knowledge belongs in the governance structure. It has not been there before. It should be. The conclave president was watching me with the same expression I had last seen in conference room 7 when I finished reading the names. I picked up my sheet. One permanent seat on the conclave Security Council, I said, non-rotating. Full voting rights. This is not a negotiating position. It is a structural correction. And GT snorts. And GT, the Security Council currently makes decisions affecting human lives without a human voice in the room. That ends. I set the sheet down. Those are our terms, I said. The Economic Board Chair exhaled. Carefully. Ambassador Reyes, he said, these terms are considerably more extensive than I know, I said. We had 71 cycles to think. Silence. Then from the conclave president, the question I had expected. Is there room for discussion on any of these points? I thought about that honestly. Yes, I said, on the timeline for the colony transfers, there is room to discuss the mechanism of transfer. On the border force command structure, there is room to discuss the reporting framework on the archive and relay network co-funding model. There is room to discuss the formula. I met his eyes. On the veto rights, the Security Council seat and the colony transfers themselves, I said, there is not. He nodded slowly. May I ask, he said carefully, what outcome you are hoping for today? It was the most direct question anyone in that room had asked me. I had spent 9 years in this building, learning to answer direct questions with careful language, appropriate language, the language of someone who wanted to remain in the room. I was not in the room anymore, not technically, not yet. I'm hoping for the outcome where we build something that does not break the way the last thing broke, I said. I am hoping that this conclave, having done something in Cycle 1 that it has since characterized as a mistake, uses the remaining cycles to correct it completely rather than partially. Partial corrections have the same structural failures as the original error. We have evidence of that. I paused. I'm hoping that when a child grows up in one of those 3 colonies, they grow up in a place that was returned to their people, not least not administered, returned. No one spoke. I thought about Kate, about her eyes and the name at the top of a document no one in this room had seen, about a family in a colony that changed hands because I signed a paper in a room that smelled of recycled air, because I believed compromise was a bridge and not a surrender. I had been wrong about that. I was not going to be wrong about it again. We have 19 cycles remaining in the transition period. I said I would like to resolve this in 10. The conclave president looked at his hands, then he looked up. We will need time to consult, he said. Of course, I said, I am available tomorrow morning if you would like to continue. I stood. Nora and Felix stood with me. I was nearly at the door when Delegate Veth spoke. Ambassador Reyes, he said. I turned. The names, he said, the watch personnel. You read at the transition review. Yes, I said. I looked some of them up, he said. After I waited, some of them had been at their stations for 4 years, he said. Some were on their 3rd rotation, voluntarily. Yes, I said. Why, he said. It was a genuine question. Not rhetorical, not diplomatic. He actually wanted to know. I thought about how to answer that in a way that would mean something to a species that had spent 40 million years in space and had long since stopped volunteering for anything that was not required. Because the edge of something is not a good place to leave empty, I said, and because we are the kind of people who notice when something is empty and decide to fill it. He was quiet. That is dangerous, he said. Yes, I said, it is also useful, depending entirely on whether you are working with us or waiting for us to stop. I left. The walk to the elevator was quiet. The corridor along the outside of the negotiation wing had windows that looked west, and the local sun was going down, turning the sky above the transit hub deep clear orange that I had only ever seen on 2 planets in my life. This planet was one of them, the other was home. I stood at the window for a moment. Felix came to stand beside me. They will accept, he said. Yes, I said. Not everything immediately. No, I said, but the shape of it they will accept the shape. And the colonies. All 3, I said. It will take a few cycles to work through the legal mechanism, but they will accept it. He was quiet. How do you know, he said. I watched a small transport lift from landing pad 3 in Bank East, rising into the orange sky. Because they have seen what Exile looks like from their side now, I said, and they do not want to discover what the next configuration looks like from ours. He nodded slowly. Go home tonight, Felix, I said. Both of you sleep. Tomorrow will be long. I called Director Grant on the walk back to the delegation offices. He answered immediately. Well, he said. We gave them the terms, I said. And they are consulting, I said. How long do you think? I told them I was available tomorrow morning, I said. A pause. Mara, he said. They will come back with questions on the timeline and the co-funding formula. I said, have the legal team ready for that. The core terms will hold. You are sure, he said. I thought about Kate, about a name at the top of a page no one had seen. Yes, I said. All right, he said, I will have the Team ready. Grant, I said. Yeah. After this is done, I said, the Kepler. Colonies after the transfer I want to go. A long pause. I will arrange it, he said. There was a family there, I said, after. The Accords, a girl named Kate, I want to find out where they ended up. He did not ask why. He had known me long enough not to ask why about the things that mattered. I will start looking, he said. Thank you, I said. I ended the call. The delegation offices were quiet. Most of the staff had gone for the evening. The lights were low. My desk had the position paper on one side and my single sheet on the other in an untouched coffee that Nora had left before she went home. I sat down. I looked at the sheet. 19 cycles left. The conclave called back at noon the following day. They had questions about the co-funding formula and the timeline for the colony administrative transfer. They had a counter-proposal on the border force reporting structure. It was a reasonable counter-proposal. Someone had worked hard on it. They did not have a counter on the veto rights. They did not have a counter on the Security Council seat. I answered the questions. I reviewed their counter-proposal with Felix and accepted the parts that were reasonable. I offered an adjusted timeline for the colony transfer that was 4 cycles, longer than my original position and still 40 cycles ahead of what they had been hoping for. They accepted it. The full agreement was signed on cycle 79, 10 cycles before the Exile would have become permanent. I signed it in the same room where the Kepler Accords had been signed, which I had not planned but did not object to. When the conclave president suggested the location, I understood why he chose it. It was the right room for it. The room smelled the same, recycled air. Long table, the particular quiet of a space where things get decided. I signed with the same pen I'd used 9 years earlier. I called Grant after. He did not ask how it went. He asked about Kate. Still looking, he said, but I found the colony records. They did not go far. A transit station 2 systems over. Her mother runs a supply operation there. Kate would be 16 now. I sat with that for a moment. 16. Old enough to know what the name of the planet she was born on meant. Old enough to understand what it meant to have a home that was not quite yours. Tell them they can come home, I said. I will, he said. And Grant, I said. Yeah. We got it back, I said, all of it. He was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said. I watched the signing. All of it, I said again. I know, Mara, he said quietly. I know. That was everything. That was the whole thing. A name at the top of a page, a girl named Kate going home. 280 people who had stood at the edge of space because someone had to, finally, receiving the recognition for having been there. 9 years of being the polite human in the room and 19 cycles of being the human outside it. It turned out the outside had better leverage. I finished my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway.